Welcome, everyone. I'm Grace Cavalieri. We are so happy to see you here. We have had this great event 3 different times this season. And first of all, we want to thank St. John's College, and especially the President's Office and Bruce Douglas for giving us a room in the house for poetry. Thank you so much. As I have said, we had 3 world-class poets already this season, and this is going to be no exception today. So we are going to be introduced by Kimberly Taylor, who is a co-sponsor of the event, and the magazine, Annapolis Home Magazine, is a co-sponsor of this series. And we are going to have a very special and unusual time today. I think you're going to have an event where you've never witnessed anything like this before, and we are so proud to bring it to you. And Kimberly's going to tell you who our authors are. Here's Kimberly Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace. It is fabulous to see so many people today. Thank you for coming out. And we always want to start our days by thanking Bruce Douglas and St. John's College and everybody who is really making this possible. Andrew Wang was born in Shanghai in 1943 and translates ancient Chinese poems from the Tang Dynasty into English verse using the quatrain form. The Tang Dynasty, which began in the early 7th century, is considered China's golden age and poetry one of its finest literary achievements. Tang poets used understandable and immediate language to capture the fleeting and profound, influencing Chinese writers until the present day. Now retired and living in Washington, D.C., Mr. Wang was the last president of Hong Kong's Legislative Council before sovereignty reverted in 1997. He brings an especially innate sensitivity and delicacy to his translations, which he will soon read to us, and which we will also discuss from your handouts after the reading. He's joined today by Stella Zhu, who has been a tutor at St. John's College since 2022. She is a translator of poetry and prose and literature, and also reviews Chinese books in translation. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wang and Stella Zhu. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace and Kimberly. Thank you, Andrew. It's lovely to have you here today with us. So I have in my hands this lovely book titled 60 Chinese Poems in English Verse. So it's a collection of English translations by Mr. Andrew Wang. And it's a collection of 60 Tang Dynasty Chinese four-line poems called quatrains that he has rendered in verse form into English. These are all new translations. So I would love to ask Andrew about how he came to the writing of this book, the collection of these poems, and translation as an activity. But first and foremost, I would love to ask Andrew to read from the collection for us. So we've selected some poetry, some poems, and we're going to read them in this way. So I would like to ask Andrew to read in Cantonese first, and then I will read in Mandarin. So these are different ways of reading the written Chinese, and then I'll ask Andrew to read his English translation.
Thank you very much, Stella. I'm sorry I lost my voice, so you'll have to excuse me if I don't sound right to you. The first poem I'm going to read is by Li Bai, or Li Po, sometimes, because of a different system of transliteration. So Li Bai is the current name. 望廬山瀑布，疑之疑。日照香爐生紫煙，遙看瀑布掛前川。飛流直下3000尺，疑是銀河落九天。
Thank you, Andrew. So in Mandarin, 望庐山瀑布2之2，李白。日照香炉生紫烟，遥看瀑布挂前川。飞流直下3000尺，疑是银河落九天。
So my rendition is like as follows. View of a mountain fall, view of a, view of a waterfall at Mount Lusan, 2 of 2. Sunlit the incense summit, in the purplish aura agleam. To afar, like a shimmering curtain, a waterfall hangs upstream, flowing, fleeting, flying, plunging 3,000 feet, as if 'twere the silver river falling from heaven supreme.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I have to ask about the making of this book. In particular, what drew you to translating Tang Dynasty poetry? What it is about the quatrains that particularly captured your fascination? And if you could tell us a little bit about the quatrains, what kind of poetry it is, I think we would love to learn about it.
Most Chinese quatrains were written, and even currently are still written, in lines of 5 characters or 7 characters. But in fact, there are ones written in 4 characters and 6 character lines. One character is represented by 1 syllable only. So you just heard Stella's reading and my reading in 2 Chinese different, you can say dialects, all right, with a different pronunciation, but very similar. And because they are of equal length, every line is of equal length. So in translating them into English, one must try to find a measure of the length of the line in a language which is polysyllabic. For a certain word, for a certain idea, you may have, you would normally have at least 1 syllable, but in fact, in many cases, there are more than 1 syllable. Cases, for example, just cases, the word. There are 2 syllables, cases. So, English being an accentual language, I've chosen not the syllable as the basis to determine the length of the line, but the number of stressed syllables in it. So if you look at this poem, sunlit, the incense summit, in a purplish aura agleam, 6. Now I've not attempted to do it in 7 syllables, in 7 beats, but because if you have the longer a line in poetry is, the more the meaning is hidden because it's too long. You may be out of breath. For that, I try to shorten the lines, but sometimes it is not possible to cover all the ideas of the original line in a very short, in a very no, I just attempt to try to shorten it, but not to the extent that you can do it as you can do it in iambic pentameter. So I've taken the beat to be 1 foot, whether it's iambic or whatever kind of foot you are using, all right? But to make it possible for the line to be heard clearly, I provide a caesura, a pause in between. So for a 6-beat line like the one I'm doing now, Sunlit the instant summit, in the purplish aura a gleam, all right? There's a very noticeable pause. The pause happening, suddenly the instant summit. After the summit, then you pause for a little while, and then you go on to say in a purplish aura again. So this is how I'm doing it.
Just move your mic up a little bit, so, yeah, maybe folks can hear a little better? Okay. Thank you.
So we're using the beat as the foot of in a line to determine the length of the line. Now this one is a hexameter, all right, because it's 6 feet, 6 feet. But I won't use the term hexameter because I'm not using the same type of foot for the entire poem. Because when you have a line, no, I stop here. Yeah.
Andrew, I'm really fascinated by something you said earlier, which is that English is an accentual language. I'm thinking now about the differences between the languages and how poetry differs because of that. So when you read, especially in Cantonese, I thought I heard rhythm. There's things flowing, there's things going, there is faster, slower movement. So it's not an accentual language, but what makes rhythm, in your opinion, in the Chinese language?
I think both languages have the same kind of flow. It's only a matter of where you put the pause.
Would you mind reading the first line, or maybe the first 2 lines for us just again? I want to hear that creation or the intention of the pause.
Sunlit the instant summit, in a purplish aura a gleam. 日照香爐生似煙. Do you feel that there is the flow which is very similar to the Chinese one? 日照香爐. Because the Chinese line, in a 7-character line, normally there's a pause after the 4th syllable, after the 4th character. 日照香爐生似煙. 遙看瀑布掛前川. It's a very significant pause. And this occurs even in shorter lines, 5-character lines, you have the same thing. 床前明月光. This is thoughts on a quiet night. It's the most famous Li Bai poem, known to every Chinese, even during childhood. So you can see that it's only a question of determination of the length of the line. That the English use of the foot as the marker cannot be done in Chinese because Chinese is not an accentual language. You can't have a number of syllables put together, armed together to form a foot in Chinese. But you can see that the pause gives you that too. Because if you're using the same line again, 日照香爐生紫煙. You can see the two pauses now. You can do it that way. So,
Would you say the musicality is universal, even though maybe the technique you use to realize that musicality might differ from languages to languages?
there is something in Chinese which is not something that you can translate into into English. That's the question of the tonal quality of a syllable. For example, the syllable ma, M-A, ma. Ma in Chinese can mean ma, which is a horse. Ma, which is mother. Ma, scolding, telling off. Ma, linen. Ma, 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 ma. They are the same syllable, but having a different tone. That is something which provides musicality to Chinese poetry, but cannot be translated into English because you can't find a similar marker to do the job.
You must be able to anticipate my next question. This sounds like a tremendous difficulty. How do you navigate that?
Write in English. That's a simple answer. Yes. So I'm attempting to write in English using markers like the foot, and also in English you can have a caesura, you can have a pause. That you can copy directly from Chinese pattern of the line. That's in my nose. I'm not sure what you have in your handout. Which poems do you have in your handout, please?
I think everyone should have the poem that we just read together. So we'll read 4 poems from Andrew's collection. The first and the fourth will be available, or, well, are available on the handouts that you have.
It's really a pity. I think you should have the other ones too.
We should have all 60 of them, Andrew.
All 60 of them.
The publisher would protest, but it would be for the greater good, I think. I'm really curious. So there's on the one hand, rendering the music of the poetry, on the other, sort of trying to say, meaning-wise, right? What's the message, perhaps? Do you find that a difficult task to navigate these two components, or maybe you don't think of them as separate tasks at all? I'm curious what you think about that in terms of translating verse.
I think it's important to remind oneself that one really is not translating anything but writing a new poem. Because you're writing a new poem. Sometimes the order of different parts of the line will need to be changed so as to convey the same meaning, or so as to be able to find a rhyme word to end the line. So the most serious case I've done was to change the order of two lines. Line 3 turned into line 4. Line 4 becomes line 3. Because that, in English, would convey the meaning of the original poem. Because certain ideas in Chinese may have to be changed to be something which is ahead of something. For example, I just quote the example. This is a poem by Bai Zhiyi. I will not do the whole poem. Originally, it's care for the cup of the good stuff, I say. Snow in the evening sky is forming. But originally in Chinese, sky in the evening sky is forming, then the invitation to come for the cup. Care for the cup of good stuff, I say. Snow in the evening sky is forming. So by changing that order, the essence of the original poem is preserved. If we don't change that order, it doesn't sound very friendly at all.
I'm looking at the poem right in front of us, the one we just read.
Yeah, all right.
So I'm thinking.
I digressed into another poem, I'm sorry.
No. I was wondering if something similar is happening here, but on a smaller scale, even though, right, you didn't change the order of any particular lines.
Right.
So the second line, when you said to afar, like a shimmering curtain, a waterfall hangs upstream. And I was thinking, yeah, in Chinese, 瀑布, the word for waterfall, sort of has the word cloth or curtain already in it.
Yeah.
But when you translate into English, it seems like, you have to maybe tease the idea out explicitly. Is that fair?
I have to, in this case, I have to fill up the line. Because the original Chinese is very simple. Yao kan, Yu Huan. From a distance, I look at 瀑布, 瀑布, 瀑, 瀑. That single character already represents waterfall. 瀑. the two put together makes the meaning even more explicit. So, in fact, 瀑布 can be regarded as one single word in Chinese, although multi-syllable. But originally, this single word, this duosyllabic word, 瀑布, originally is made up of two words. One is 瀑, which means waterfall. 布 means cloth. It's a piece of cloth. So I've extended that to a metaphor, to a simile, like a shimmering curtain. Shimmering is a different way of, is a poetic way of representing flash of water. Shimmering curtain, that translates 布. Hangs upstream, 挂前春. Very simple translation, very direct. So direct that I have to fill in the empty space left over because I need 6 beats for this line.
Earlier you said that sometimes maybe we have this desire to keep writing and writing and writing, but it turns out the longer it is, the more hidden the message became. And I'm still thinking about that idea. Somehow the compactness actually makes the poetry more beautiful or more true?
This is a question of beauty.
Yes. Is that a question on your mind?
I think I've written better than Li Bai. But the two are not comparable because they're in two different languages. So I think I've been able to do it in English. Perhaps not better than Li Bai, but at least to match the beauty of Li Bai's poem. 遥看瀑布挂前春. So happens I can use the word hangs upstream to translate 挂前春. 挂 gives me the license to introduce curtain. Because you 挂 a curtain, you hang a curtain. This is a creation of it's conversely used the word 挂 to bring out the idea of a curtain, which is made of cloth. But shimmering curtain gives the water part to it.
And remind us of a gleam that was there in the first line. That's when I heard shimmer, I thought back to the imagery in the beginning. So Andrew, I would like to ask you to read we can't get enough of this. I would like to ask you to read 2 more poems for us. So unfortunately, these are not available on the handout, but maybe that's a good occasion for us to listen to them because they are music after all. So Andrew, would you like to read this poem in Cantonese?
張繼風橋夜泊，月落烏啼霜滿天。江風如火對愁眠，姑蘇城外寒山寺。夜半鐘聲到客船。
Thank you, Andrew. I'll say quickly, this is a poem about the city that I'm from. So I insisted that Andrew include this.
Stella is from Suzhou. Suzhou was called Gusu.
It's a poem that I hold very dearly, and I think you will love Andrew's translation. I'll read it in Mandarin first. 枫桥夜泊，月落乌啼霜满天，江枫渔火对愁眠。姑苏城外寒山寺，夜半钟声到客船。
Thank you, Stella. Moored for the Night by the Maple Bridge by Zhang Ji. The moon is down, ravens cawing, a frostiness fills the sky. By the riverside maples and fishing lights, insomnious sad am I. Beyond the walls of Gusu city, their Hansan temple stands. Goes bong its midnight bell to touch the boat wherein I lie.
Thank you, Andrew. So I was asked to talk a little bit about my translation as well. And I'll do that briefly and we'll go back to Andrew. So I took up translation during the late COVID years, initially to self-soothe because I couldn't go home and visit my family. But I also fell in love with the activity and just the joy of reading the language that I grew up speaking. Most of what I translate are prose. A substantive part of that is science fiction. But today I thought I would share two pieces of poetry instead that I translated back in 2021. They were written by a contemporary Chinese poet by the name of Li Xiaoyang, who is young, still writing, lives in Beijing right now. So the poet himself was someone that I could reach out to during the translation process, unlike in the case of Andrew, which makes a little difference. Another difference lies in the source material itself. So despite both being Chinese poetry, the author that I translated from wrote in the modern vernacular Chinese as opposed to classical Chinese. And it is in free verse as opposed to regulated quatrain. So it's going to sound different, I think. Even if you don't speak any variety of Chinese, I think some of this difference can be picked up by our ears. So the first poem is called Lock. I'll read the original in Mandarin first, and then my translation in English. This poem was originally published in 2017. 锁，李孝阳。命运里关联钥匙，关联贼，如同生活关联明亮与腐朽的事物，关联宽容或缄默。无论精致、银质与铜质，保护一扇门的同时，也将牵绊留于龛外。夜来临，锁便陷入无限的警觉。通常，锁活在自己的空心里，以刑具的对称性来启庇他物，而驻空的部分需要更精确的力来完成启示。And this is how I rendered it into English. The lock, fastened to keys and thieves in its fate, as life is fastened to the bright and degenerate, to forgiveness or silence. Whether gold, silver, or bronze, in guarding a door, it also leaves longing beyond the threshold. When night falls, the lock sinks into infinite vigilance. Normally, the lock lives in its hollow core, opening and closing another with the symmetry of shackles. And where it is gnawed away by worms, demands a more precise force for its complete disclosure. Second poem by the same author is called 石头经. I said the book of rocks, could be the scripture of rocks, could be the sutra of rocks. Jing is a word that came originally from weaving. So when you weave, you set up the vertical threads first, and then you weave with the horizontal threads. The verticals are called jing, the warp. The horizontal are called the weft, and their way. So when the book is referred to as a jing, it's a kind of a guiding vertical thread. But I thought, well, book might do as well. And when we say a book of rocks in English, I think there's a kind of ambiguity there. Is this book made of rocks, about rocks? Or are the rocks a book? Such as when we say the book of nature, I think what we mean is nature is a book in some way. All of these senses are very much there in the Chinese as well. And this was originally published in 2018. 石头经，世界靠石头来加深自己，刻、凿、雕，在铁器里剃度，石头方有了佛的肉身。世身在寻找身外之身，石头的一生是硬的，甚至秘密，甚至欢喜，都安然于平缓的脉象。大水灌岸，淤泥里的石头还藏明定的玉，而不安是给石头负刑的人。And I rendered it into English this way. The Book of Rocks. The world depends on rocks to grow in depth, carving, chiseling, and sculpting. Receiving its tonsure under iron, a rock then acquires the flesh body of a Buddha. This body is searching for a body beyond the bodies. The life of a rock is hard. Even secrets, even joys, have calmly settled into a gentle pulse. When water floods the bank, rocks in the mud conceal in their bosoms fateful jade, while doubts are for those who give rocks shape. That's all.
谢谢。
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to ask Andrew to read one last poem. So this is the second poem on your handouts. And then after that, I think we should open the floor for some discussion, questions. So Andrew, please.
This is in Cantonese. 竹枝詞，流雨聲，拜了雨時。楊柳青青，江水平，聞郎江上唱歌聲。東邊日出，西邊雨，道是無情，卻有情。
Thank you, Andrew. 竹之词2之1，刘禹锡。杨柳青青江水平，闻郎江上唱歌声。东边日出西边雨，道是无情却有情。
Thank you, Stella. Song of Bamboo Twigs by Liu Yuxi. Green, oh green is the willow, placid, peaceful the flow. Hark, and I hear on the river songs for my love, my bow. To the east the sun is out, the west drizzles persist. Ah, they say the sun is not, To me, my son is a glow.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I forgot to ask you to read the third poem, did I? 静夜思.
I've forgotten, yeah.
We should maybe.
Doesn't matter.
I think we should hear that. This is the one poem where every single Chinese person knows because you learn it either in school when you're 5 or
At home.
At home, that's right. This is one of the first poems the parents would teach a child.
靜夜思，李白。The poem by 李白 again. 床前明月光. Notice the pause is after the second. 床前明月光，疑是地上霜。舉頭望明月，低頭思故鄉。
Thank you, Andrew. 静夜思，李白。床前明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡。
Thoughts on a quiet night. Thoughts on a quiet night. Beyond the bench bed, the bright moonlight, or be frost on the ground, I wonder it might. I raise my head, the moon to behold, then droop it, musing, I'm homesick tonight.
Thank you, Andrew.
Don't know what.
So everybody has a handout, right, with the 2 poems on it. I think we should open up for questions. Yeah, if you have any questions for Andrew and I, especially about the poems here. Yes.
My question is, you said that. Hello. You said that your translation, by translating, you're writing a new poem. And my question is whether you think that a different translator would write a different poem.
I was trying to say that when you translate a poem, you're writing a new poem, in the sense that you attempt to translate, but your efforts will fail. Because you can never translate something from a certain language into another language which has a different cultural background and different associations with 2 words which are equivalent in the 2 languages, but their associated meanings might differ tremendously. So you can never succeed in doing so. So in that sense, I was advising people. I would advise myself then first of all, advise myself that I can't really translate a poem. I'm writing a new one, but with the essence of the original poem. So I've been trying to stick to the same kind of pattern poetry looks like and sounds like in a different language, in the English language. So I tried to do that. I tried to cover the meaning of it. I tried to cover the hidden messages inside it, if there are any. But these are all my interpretation. So different translators will arrive at different solutions and different poems. I recently bought a book by a now famous translator called Arthur C. Has anyone? I bought this book in Rochester recently, only about a month ago. He has translated Night Thoughts, Thoughts on the Quiet Night, and also Zhang Ji's More for the Night by the Maple Bridge, at Maple Bridge. You see at once that he has done it very, very differently. If you like to read it.
I could read it. I'll read the one titled Night Thoughts. And maybe after that, I'll remind everybody the translation that Andrew did, perhaps.
Yeah.
Night Thoughts. The moonlight falls by my bed. I wonder if there is frost on the ground. I raise my head to look at the moon, then ease down, thinking of home.
And the other one is 凤桥夜报.
Thank you. It's by Zhang Ji, Mooring at Night by the Maple Bridge. Moon sinks, crows cry, a frostful sky. River maples, fishing fires, grieving in sleep. At Gusu, beyond the city walls, cold mountain temple. Midnight, a bell sounds, reaching a traveler's boat. So we just read the same poems. They
So
strike me as really different.
I would like to know if all poetry from the Tang Dynasty had nature images.
Not all.
Oh.
There are all kinds of poetry in the Tang Dynasty. Du Fu is famous for, say, some anti-war poems. So the subject can be anything, not necessarily nature.
Hello. I have a question on the decision of translation. I noticed that in the Chinese text there is no commas or period. And I guess for Chinese people, when you look at the language, you can understand it. But when I looked at the translation, there's usage of comma, semicolon, and also period. And also like connecting it back to the balance between the context and also like the melody. I wonder, like, how do you decide whether to use a comma or a period or a semicolon? Yeah.
That would depend on the English you have written. And first of all, must depend on how you read the original poem.
I've recently begun here at the college a small haiku society. So I was kind of interested and pleased to hear you say that length can, I forget the exact word you used, but distract from the meaning of the poem. Did you mean this in the sense of the literal meaning, like the sentence, or the way we somewhat erroneously use meaning in English to refer to the significance or beauty of the poem? And if you could say a little more about this idea of over-lengthening the original can damage the meaning in whichever sense you meant it.
there are bound to be controversies over the interpretation of certain words in a poem or in anything at all. For example, the last one, the thoughts on the quiet night. The word 床, the word bed. Does it really mean bed? Now Arthur C. takes it to be bed. But I've changed that to bench bed, which is not really bed inside the house, which is a bench in the front yard or the backyard. But there are even other interpretations. 床 can also mean, it can be found in the dictionary, that they are the barrier, the railing around the well to stop you from falling into the well. All right, so 床前明月光. Is it moonlight shining on my bed? That's not. Inside the house, that's not really very possible. So it's a question of interpreting the word. You can never tell whether you have done the interpretation correctly or wrongly, because it was written such a long time ago. And in the case of Li Bai, because of the existence of another poem where the word 床 is used. 切花初福啊，折花門前劇，郎騎竹馬來，繞床弄青梅. This is the ballad of Chang'an. 绕床弄青梅，那床是什么意思？ Certainly not referring to the bed, but to something else. And that suits the interpretation that it is a well railing in the front yard, that a boy comes into the girl's house to play outside around the well. So I'm not sure whether I have responded correctly at your query. What was your query?
So it had to do with the thing you said earlier, that over-lengthening a line of a poem can cover up the meaning thereof. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, and whether you mean the meaning in the sense of, you know, the objects in the phrase, or the way we use meaning in English, like, you know, the significance of the thing. But yeah, if you could say a little more about, like, the way that length shadows meaning.
The length?
Yeah, earlier in the... You said a little earlier. You said a little earlier, like a really interesting thing. There was like, it was with regard to the first poem, I believe, the Li Bai. They're like if you over-lengthen the line, it's no good.
It is sometimes necessary. In fact, it's helpful. Currently, I'm doing one poem by Wang Xi. It doesn't really matter what it is. At the end of a poem, there is a three-character representation of a human being. All right, it's called 弄猪人, 疑似弄猪人. Long means handling or play with. 珠 pearls. 人 man, woman, human being. 弄珠人. Of the earlier lines I have interpreted, I have done it like this. Of a sudden, in sight, some winter sweet trees, flowering at the bank, flowering by the bank of River Han, of the River Han. No, not flowering. Let me do it another way. Some winter sweet trees by the bank of River Han in bloom. Not knowing spring hues or springtide has come this early, to have thought they were pearl mates. Then I need to add something to it to explain what pearl mates are. According to my interpretation, I've interpreted 弄珠人 to mean pearl mates who are divers diving down into the river to gather pearls. But 弄珠人 can be interpreted in a different manner, because according to some, or by reference to some other writings by some other writers earlier, or at least during that period, to refer to mermaids. So if I insist on my pearl mates interpretation, I may have to add something to it. Say something like, they're divers, I presume, to rhyme with in bloom. So by adding something to it, I can create a rhyme. I can also explain my choice of interpreting the poem as referring to the author fantasizing that these were diver girls. So I hope that satisfies you.
Very quickly, so there are a lot of hens. If you could keep them in the air, and then I think this ma'am over here has had her hen. Yeah, you. So if we start, and everyone else, if you can keep your hands in the air for a little bit, I'm just gonna keep track of them, and then I'll let you know. How about that? Okay. Oh, going order. Yeah.
I just want to add, it's fascinating to hear how Andrew translated with different interpretation of 弄珠人. But my question is about your poetry here. I'm wondering that how you translate homophones, because in the poetry here, 百流语习, 竹枝词, the last sentence, 道是无情却有情. We know that 情 means sunny days, 晴天, but 情 can also be 爱情, love. That you mentioned during your in your translation, the second sentence you mentioned about the songs from my love. I'm just wondering that when you translate poetry, Chinese poetry, how do you make decision to translate those homophones with two different meanings but with one pronunciation? Thank you, Andrew.
I think I've done the best. Among all the different translations of this poem, the double entendre, I've used the sun, the word sun, and brought it through. Line 3 reads, to the east the sun is out, the sun is out. The west, drizzles persist. Ah, they say the sun is not, 无情. The sun is not, the sun, let's carry on. Ah, they say the sun is not. To me, my sun is a glow. That's love. The sun is not, the sun is a glow to me.
The gentleman.
So it's a question of, you use the word homophone. Okay, homophone. To be more positive, it is a double entendre. Use the playing on the word 情, 晴天的晴, 感情的情.
The gentleman.
I don't have any other translation of that poem, with me. I only happen to have bought this book, which I leafed through to find that two of the poems I've chosen were also translated by Mr. Arthur C.
Should go to the gentleman at the door.
Thank you. I noticed when Ms. Xu and Mr. Huang, when you read the poems, that you translated first from the Old Chinese, the Mandarin, and then you read it in Canton, and then we heard it in English. And when I was listening to you read the original in the Chinese, it sounded very dramatic. My ear, not only homophones are important because their words sound alike, but sound, all kinds of other aspects of sound are important. And I heard a kind of a dramatic rendering, and I was eagerly anticipating what this was going to sound like in English. But when I got to the English, it sounded less dramatic and less emotional. I wonder if there's something inherently more subdued in English or the American English that we speak than in the original.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know how to respond to that. I had thought, perhaps I failed, I had thought that I have rendered the Chinese poems into English with equal effect. For example, sunlit the incense summit in a perpetual gleam. 日照香爐生紫煙.
And
Whether or not it is more or less dramatic all depends on when I read it and reread it, I might have sounded different. So even in the same language, I may read them differently. But of course, I mean, in different languages, the effects may not be identical. For example, even read in Chinese, if you read it in Mandarin or read it in Cantonese, they might sound very different. Because in the two dialects, there are certain changes, certain differences that can make one language more poetic than the other. For example, I've talked about the Cantonese, the Chinese, no, not just Cantonese, but all Chinese are tonal languages. I gave you the example of ma, 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 ma. And in current day Mandarin, ma, 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 ma. That nhập sinh, that entering. Is missing in Mandarin.
Are there more tones in Cantonese?
There are more tones, but I'm lamenting on the loss, on the virtual loss, disappearance of one tone in Mandarin. That's the ru sheng. For example, there is no ik sound, there's no ik syllable in Mandarin. A poem by Li Qingzhao. Kimberly, I was going to give you this one. There's a poem called Sing Sing Man, Sing Sing Man. A slow tune, it's called, the title of the poem. The beginning lines sound a bit like this in Cantonese. Chum chum, make make. Lang lang, ching ching. Chai chai, cham cham, chick chick. You can hear the very strong make make, the ik sound. Chick chick, the last part. Ik ik. But in pronouncing Mandarin is 寻寻觅觅, 冷冷清清, 凄凄凄凄凄, 惨惨戚戚, 戚戚, 凄凄惨惨戚戚. It's not on the clumsiness of how the last line sounded. It's the disappearance of the ik sound. So if you read a Chinese poem in Mandarin and you read a Chinese poem in Cantonese, if the poem happens to have a very strong effect of the ru sheng, the entering tone quality, which makes it a very sad sound altogether. If you read in Mandarin, that sadness is lost. So I think this is the answer to your question. Yes, personal performance is one thing, but different languages may have different effects because of the I can't say that you have tones in English, but you do have tones. But tones are hidden as accents. There are even stronger accents to convey anger, to create sense of frustration, whatnot.
Yes, yes. I noticed in both of the quatrains here, they fall into two parts. First two lines and the second two lines seem to go together, and in each case, you have made sentences in that way. So my first question is whether that's characteristic of these quatrains. And the second one is, I was looking at the first poem, and it seems as though the first half indicates a kind of fixity. That is, we see the summit, we see the waterfall hanging there as though it's something fixed, like a curtain that simply hangs. But then in the second two lines, everything seems to be passing away, everything is moving, falling. Is that correct? That is that how the poem feels? And is it because the speaker approaches the waterfall, that is, sees it more closely, or does the speaker have a new idea?
You made a fair point, very fair point. I had always wondered in doing this translation, what is what was the distance between the poet and the waterfall? So I dismissed it altogether. Simply, literally translated the original poem, except the part I added, the part about shimmering, to represent waterfall, the curtain to represent the waterfall, the pool part of the waterfall.
If I may add really quickly, this is a question that I share as well. When we look at a lot of classical Chinese paintings, the same question rises, right? You have these drawings, it's beautiful, of waterfall, of mountains. The question comes up, where exactly is the artist standing or sitting? Because you can see details as well as the entire mountain, and it's not clear if they're standing up high or down somewhere. Maybe they're everywhere.
Yeah.
I think there was the lady in the gray dress, a gray hat.
Chinese language is highly concise, and it carries multiple layers of meanings, as you mentioned, and through the questions and your explanations, the answers were already conveyed. But my question is, so for example, Zhang, that the table of the bed, it can be a day bed or bench. So in multiple ways you can translate or can be understood. Top of that, without understanding the cultural backgrounds and cultural references, like a Taoist, Buddhist, those elements, cultural elements, if without fully understanding that cultural aspects, the Westerners who are not familiar with those cultural backgrounds cannot fully understand or there will be some misunderstanding. So is there any time for you to make some footnote for the readers? Or is it completely readers' responsibilities?
I have footnotes in my book, but very brief ones,
I see.
not complete ones.
So sometimes you make a footnotes.
I do. Not in the handouts, but in my book.
I see.
I think Sarah had a question earlier.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. My question is about, in English poetry, sometimes capitalization is used to provide emphasis or have other meanings. And I noticed in your first poem, you capitalized Incest Summit, Silver River, and Heaven Supreme, and kind of what your thought process was and if there was relation to the Chinese for why you would capitalize those.
So the Incense Summit, for example, is capitalized.
When I translate a Chinese name of a place, name of a person, I capitalize them. Whether they are translated into English as English words, or whether they are transliterations of the Chinese. So, Incense Summit, in the original poem, was Xianglu. It's an incense censer, if correctly. If translated correctly, incense censer, or simply censer will do. But censer doesn't sound very good because it may be confusing, it may give you a different idea. That's going to censor. It's about censorship. So I've used incense, added summit to it, because censer doesn't mean a mountain. Incense doesn't mean a mountain. So I have used summit, which is added to it. Lu Feng would have the meaning of mountain censer. Lu, censer, Feng, mountain. But incense doesn't have that, so I need to add summit into it. 日照香炉，香炉。香炉 is a censer. I've used. No, you were talking about capitalization. I'm talking about translating it into something. It's metonymy, using part to stand for the whole, or the whole standing for a part. So back to the capitalization part. Transliterations are capitalized. Even names translated in English, if they are place names or human names, they are capitalized. That's a simple answer.
The gentleman at the door.
Thank you. Caro mio ben! Italian. When translated into English, do ti la so, come for ye, or come to me. Today, AI can translate multilingual at the same time. I'm too old to learn, but I would like to share with the floor. Can AI overpower man's creative thinking? Thank you.
Is that a question for Andrew?
If I know enough about AI, then I think I better give up translating because AI is going to do it better than. Because last year, some friends of mine tried to chat GPT and gave instructions to translate a certain poem. Let's never mind what that poem is. But he asked AI, chat GPT, to translate all 4 lines rhymed. And the result came out. I wasn't satisfied with it because line 3 was completely incorrect. So I would do it otherwise. But it's because AI was given the wrong instructions, rhyming all 4 lines. That might have created my dissatisfaction. I suppose one day I don't need to translate anymore because translations would be perfect. But I'm still doing it. Because in the meantime, you need to do it. In the meantime, you need people to check on the accuracy of the AI translations.
The gentleman at the end of the table.
Hi, thanks for being here. So I wasn't going to speak to AI, but I would say maybe AI as a proposal or consideration just is another tool to structure things differently, to see things or perceive things differently, not necessarily correctly. But my question is this: why did you get into poetry? Does poetry still bring you joy and happiness and delight? Is there something in poetry that brings you delight? And another part of the question would be, what do you hope for us to get out of your poetry? And what do you get from poetry, whether it's your own or others?
In my blog, I've said that I picked this up as a hobby only. I don't claim to have any expertise on translation. No expertise on theories of translation or even the practice of translation. I just do it for pleasure, my own pleasure. If I get invited to talk about my translations, I'd be happy. That's part of the enjoyment. If nobody asks for my translations, I don't mind. I've had my own satisfaction. So that's it. It's a hobby. It's a pastime. Because it's a pastime, I don't need to take it as homework that I have to do, or company work that I have to do, or even political work that I have to do. I don't have to.
Okay, so I guess we have Kimberly and the lady in black.
My question is, Stella, you've translated a poem from the 21st century and Andrew from the 8th century. And I'm just wondering if you see sort of a continuing thread between those centuries on the influence of Chinese poetry. Does the agent continue to exist in the modern, and maybe even speaking about metaphor and its use?
Metaphors can remain forever, really. So we're still using the same metaphors or creating new ones. even creating new ones. So the thing is, whether I should lament it or not, that Chinese poetry is going into free verse, which according to me is not poetry. It may be very poetic. I mean, the message behind and the things described may be very poetic. Yeah. It's not poetry, because poetry is meant to be heard, meant to be read, meant to be sung, meant to be heard by others. So there must be that element of sound in it, the length of lines, the stresses, and in the case of Chinese, the tones. The flow of the tones is very important in Chinese poetry. And these have to do with the hearing part, with the singing part, the saying part, etc. But in modern day Chinese poetry, you can still find efforts in trying to rhyme part of it. But that's one thing. The other thing is, classical styles of poetry is still practiced in China, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, anywhere. And there are even poets writing Chinese poetry, classical style, in current-day Washington. Because I've heard about the existence of a certain society of Chinese poets in the DC. So it's still very much alive. Thank you.
I'll probably be. I think we also have a lady right here who had her hand up.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting. I am a linguist, and I'm asking from a linguistic point of view. Language changes, sound changes, and meanings change. And it's been a long time since Tang poets wrote these poems. So I'm wondering if there have been some kind of reconstructed works, like what it must have actually sounded and meant. And in this area, maybe AI can actually help. And from this, I mean, language variation diachronically and synchronically, there must be something of the essence that move people. So maybe that's where the translation should go for. But I'm more interested in the aspects of language itself.
How exactly do you mean by?
Because sound should have changed, because that's how you have dialectal variation. And so when these poems were written, maybe it's not quite the same as today's. And also you already have a very different rendition, whether you are reading in Cantonese or Mandarin. So I'm just thinking of the translation itself. Maybe you try to catch what makes them beautiful and what moves people when you read this in whatever form. So I don't know whether I make myself clear, but it's a question of language. Yeah.
I don't pretend I understand what you're asking, but But I've said that when languages change, I mean, they gain something or they lose something. I've given you one example of loss of something.
Yeah, I'm not actually referring to what the loss would have been, but what the difference would have been. Because the meaning could have actually been different originally. And maybe you can borrow linguistic reconstruction method to get to it. But I don't know how much scholarship has been done in that area. Like some people, some linguists must have studied, because there is a method of reconstruction, what it would have sounded, because the language usually changes systematically, not just randomly. Anyway, I don't think.
Well, I don't understand.
Yeah, that's
You
fine.
say language changes and
Yeah.
always changes for better or for worse.
Oh, it's not a,
When you
it's
say
not a
reconstruction,
question of, it's
you
like
mean we
saying,
ought to reconstruct it or let it reconstruct itself?
yeah, so the sound.
I'm not saying that the 入声 disappearance of 入声 is due to someone's effort. It's a question of the Han language acquiring the Hu, the non-Han elements into the language, making 入声 disappear.
Yeah, but
Would that be-
even native.
Is that called reconstruction?
Yeah, I think we are talking of different things. But even native language changes, not just because of borrowing. So there are some natural changes, some historically recorded. I mean, linguists do this, historical linguists. So I'm just wondering if there have been works that have actually talked about these differences from the original work and today's reading. I think it's probably not so relevant to this group. So,
I
yeah, just
Uh,
I'll have to excuse myself again. I don't really understand it.
it said you pronounce the same word, and do you think it's different, sound differently with one syllable word? For example, in the 9th century, or changed? Maybe that's the sound changes in pronunciation.
The sound, of course, changes. I mean, just one poem. 夕陽無限好，只是近黃昏。
Yeah, you cannot talk, just in individual cases. It has to be a systematic change. Then linguists can reconstruct what it would have sounded at that time.
We don't really know how a tongue person would.
That's exactly my question, whether there has been any scholarship trying to reconstruct.
Oh, there has been a lot of people trying to reconstruct.
I'm sure there has been. And
Reconstruct
in that case,
middle-
AI would help. So
We
That's
may
all.
have to leave that question
Yeah.
for AI to answer, perhaps. I think maybe great. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, you will never hear anything like this again. This was a one and only time to have such a great translator and scholar as Dr. Andrew Wong and Stella Zhu so beautifully has woven all this together. I feel so fulfilled. I have never, ever been in an experience like this where we parse the syllables of the Tang Dynasty poetry, and it has been a beautiful day. This has been the fourth in our series of Poets in the Conversation Room, and we will continue in 2025, and we'll let you all know the season of Poets once a month. So thank you all for coming. Dr. Wong's book is found on Amazon. And do you have any final? No, I do have one final note. The Mitchell Gallery in January is going to have a series of scholarly stones from the Penjing Museum in Washington, D.C. These stones are natural works of art which have inspired people like Duchamp and many other artists. And it is a very rare display that there will be beginning in January 23rd at the Mitchell Gallery until April. So we'll be telling you more about that. And that is another Chinese feast. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Detailed and very interesting. Do you think the questions were worthy of you?
Yeah,
Did you enjoy the questions?
yeah.